Good evening, everyone. We're going to get started. Thank you for coming out on this incredibly warm evening, and I apologize for the heat in this room. I see you're using your program very effectively as a fan, so that's good. I'd like to welcome you all to the 28th Annual Panel on the American Presidency. I'm Ramu Nagapan. I'm the Director of the Department of Humanities and Education at UC Berkeley Extension. We're the co-presenter of this event with the Institute of Governmental Studies at the Robert T. Matsui Center for Politics and Public Service. The event's also supported by the UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism, the Townsend Center for the Humanities, the Goldman School of Public Policy, the Institute of International Studies, and the Charles and Louise Travers Department of Political Science. Many of you are probably very familiar with my organization, Berkeley Extension, and the range of course offerings and public service events. We have a new summer catalog out. You'll find that on the table outside. I encourage you to peruse it. On the back of today's program, there are a list of courses that might entice you, as well as a notice for an upcoming event, the inaugural Matsui Forum that's sponsored by our one of our partners, the Institute for Governmental Studies. So. We're proud to have been part of this event for so long, this annual review of the political climate. And this year, of course, our panel convenes to discuss a new administration as it confronts the unique circumstances facing the country and the globe. So before we get started, just some logistics. I'll offer the usual reminder, please silence your cell phones. We're handing out index cards. They'll be coming down the aisle soon. Take one, pass it down. Those cards are for you to put down a question you'd like the panel to consider during the Q&A session at the end. Let me say a few words of introduction for our moderator tonight, Ethan Rarick. Ethan is the director of the Center on Politics and Publications at the Institute of Governmental Studies. As a journalist, he's widely covered politics in California and Oregon. He is the author of California Rising, The Life and Times of Pat Brown, and his most recent book is Desperate Passage, The Donner Party's Perilous Journey West. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our distinguished panelists and our moderator.
Thank you. Thank you, Ramu, and thank you all for coming. I echo Ramu's thanks for coming on a very hot day to a very hot room. Let me just jump right in and introduce the panel, and then we'll get going. To my far left is Theda Skocpol. Theda is the Victor S. Thomas Professor of Government and Sociology at Harvard. She's also been the director of the Center for American Political Studies and dean of the School of Arts and Sciences at Harvard.
Back to the Graduate School of Arts.
The graduate school, my apologies. She's a past president of the American Political Science Association, a member of the National Academy of Sciences, has received numerous awards and honors, including a Guggenheim Fellowship and the Woodrow Wilson Foundation Award, given for the best book of the year on government, politics, or international affairs. That went for her book, Protecting Soldiers and Mothers, The Political Origins of Social Policy in the United States. That is only one of many books of which she is the author or the editor. Others include Boomerang, Health Reform and the Turn Against Government, and Inequality and American Democracy, What We Know and What We Need to Learn. She also writes widely in the press, including blogging on Talking Points Memo, a website with which many of you may be familiar. To my immediate left is Kathleen Parker, who is a columnist for the Washington Post Writers Group. Her column now appears in more than 350 newspapers. In 1993, she received the H.L. Mencken Award, which is given for distinguished writing. In the words of the judges, she received the award for, quote, attacking ignorance and stupidity with vividness and originality. Although she is often seen as a conservative, she wrote a much discussed column last year in which she urged Governor Palin to step down from the Republican ticket. I read somewhere, and she can tell us later if this is true, I guess I read somewhere that generated 11,000 responses. 20,000, all right.
Yeah.
Presumably many of them using language we can't repeat.
Not nice.
Yeah. Kathleen has written for many publications, including the Weekly Standard and Time. She's on the board of contributors of USA Today. She's been a regular guest on the Chris Matthews Show. She's also the author of a book that was published last year, Save the Males, Why Men Matter, Why Women Should Care.
It is a funny book.
To my immediate right is Maria Echaveste, who served in many positions in the Clinton administration, initially as administrator of the U.S. Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division, later as Director of Public Liaison at the White House, and then finally from 1998 until the end of the Clinton administration as Deputy Chief of Staff to the President. In that role, she had oversight responsibility for many of President Clinton's domestic policy initiatives, including education, civil rights, and immigration issues, among others. Since leaving the White House, she has joined our Berkeley Law School, of which she is a distinguished alumna, I might add. She has joined the Berkeley Law School as a lecturer in residence. She's also a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. She co-founded the Nueva Vista Group, a consulting firm with clients both in the corporate and the nonprofit world. She serves as a frequent guest on the PBS program To the Contrary, and she is a member of the Democratic National Committee, in fact, of the Executive Committee of the Democratic National Committee. And of course, as serving on the DNC makes her one of the much discussed superdelegates. To my far right is David Frum, an author and journalist with a history of both working within the conservative movement and critiquing it. He is the author of 5 books, the most recent of which is Comeback: Conservatism That Can Win Again. His past books include The Right Man, The Surprise Presidency of George W. Bush, and An End to Evil: What's Next in the War on Terror, which was co-authored with Richard Pearl. In 2001 and 2002, he served as a speechwriter to President George W. Bush. He is currently a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He also, by my count, correct me if I'm wrong, writes 3 weekly columns.
And I edit a daily blog.
And I was just going to say that he is the founder and the creator and editor of a new blog called newmajority.com, a collection of both political news and commentary, the slogan of which is, borrowing from the subtitle of your recent book, Building a Conservatism That Can Win Again. So, a very distinguished panel this year. Let's start, I think, by before we get to Obama as president, let's start by talking about how Obama got to be president and talk a little bit about the 2008 election. And I'll turn first to Theda, although as always in this event, as I told you earlier, I want all of you to just jump in and not stand on ceremony. But Theda, what did this election mean? What did this 2008 election mean? An affirmation of Obama, a rejection of McCain or of Bush? Was there an ideological shift here? What do you think it meant?
You know, I tell my students that they're lucky because they're living through what will prove to be, in one or many ways, one of the watershed elections in American history. It's pretty obvious that it's extraordinary that an African American, and perhaps even more extraordinary, the son of a foreign student, was elected president of the United States, signaling a new attitude, I think, on race and on our relationship to the rest of the world. It's also possible that this will turn out to be that beast that political scientists have been hunting my entire life, a realigning election. Although we don't know about realigning elections simply from what happens on election night. We did see a Democrat here, probably any Democrat who would have won the nomination under the circumstances of the economic meltdown. He won a decisive victory, and it was an election in which there's a pretty clear break by the majority of the American citizenry outside the Deep South with the direction of foreign policy and economic policy under the Republicans and under former President Bush. But we won't know if this is going to be an opportunity that Obama and the Democrats can build on to create a sustained majority until we see how he does in getting his agenda through and how the economy and the world respond, part of which is not under the control of any president. The final thing I want to just mention briefly, though, is I think this is quite a remarkable election for the methods of mobilization that were used by the Obama campaign, both to win the nomination in a very tough competition with Hillary Clinton. In many ways, that was the most riveting drama of the election, and to build a commanding majority with some new population groups, including Latinos, states in the Upper South. I would say that for the first time, we saw a Democrat marry the new technologies of fundraising and communication to a remarkable grassroots face-to-face effort across virtually all of the 50 states. We've seen something like that from conservatives in the recent decades, but this is the first time we really saw that in a Democratic presidential campaign, and it was not just a big victory in terms of the aggregate numbers, it was a startling victory that involved young people, Latinos, a mobilization of the African American population to a higher level, an overall turnout, and a lot of face-to-face contacting that creates something Democrats can build on if they're able, and that's a big if.
Kathleen, can Democrats build on this?
Well, we'll see, but I want to jump back and answer the original question because I think I have a perspective that is a little bit more on the ground in that place called the South where I live. I live in South Carolina when I'm not in Washington. I divide my time, as they say. But I think this was a very important turning point for this country. And I think I witnessed it on the ground in South Carolina. And let me just explain it this way. I cannot tell you the number of people who would come up to me and say, "Don't tell anyone, but I'm voting for Obama." Or I couldn't let this be known at work, but I'm voting for Obama. And these were people who had always voted Republican, at least since the 80s. Everybody used to be a Democrat once upon a time in South Carolina. But here's what I think happened. First of all, I don't think anyone could have beaten Obama. It was just his time. It was the time for this particular individual. People were ready for the change. Where McCain appeared chaotic, Obama appeared calm. But something else happened when, on the hustings, people in my part of the country saw something they didn't want to be a part of, something that was quite ugly. And unfortunately, Sarah Palin was the person that the Republican Party put out front in a skirt, winking, and said, and sort of started building this idea of Obama as being this other kind of exotic creature. And basically, it's called race baiting. And it was sexualized in the person of Sarah Palin. And I think for a lot of people, they saw that, and the scales fell from their eyes, and they said, whatever that is, I cannot be a part of that. And they walked away. So in a sense, at least from that little small part of the country and that one little scenario, I think it represents a real shift. And I think people saw things for the first time that they hadn't quite noticed before. And they might have been able to wink and nod and look the other way or avert their gaze. But when you make a direct play toward those darker parts of people's hearts, and when you see that for what it is, you have to make a choice. And I think that's what happened in part.
Maria?
I would just, both to the original question and to what was just said, I actually think this election and the primary leading up to it, I think will be the subject of dissertations for at least another decade or more. Because there's just so much in terms of having a woman running, an African American, just generational, it just goes on and on. But I think one thing, at least September, October of 2008, was that the economic crisis was such that for a number of people in the middle, race just didn't become the issue. They didn't have the luxury to focus on race and really sort of peel back and it's like, okay, what is this election about? What is it that I care about? And who is talking about those issues to me? So I think that is just something that's, as I said, we're going to study this for a long time. But the second thing is, I'm not so sure that it was as historic in the alignment way as some might want. And the realignment and sort of liberal, conservative. And that's based on the following, that notwithstanding the longest election cycle ever, 2 years, we at the end, after you tallied up the votes, it was about 52%, 51, I mean, it wasn't 70% turnout of those eligible and registered to vote. And I'm looking at the political science.
It was the largest turnout since 1964.
In numbers, but not in percentage. And what I'm basing it on is the state of Ohio. And I've seen some numbers that in Ohio, which was, you'll recall, fought over 2004, they actually, the actual number of votes cast were fewer in 2008. A number of people who voted in 2004 didn't come out to vote in 2008, and lots of new people came out to vote. And so there's something about the new people coming out to vote and other people deciding not to come out to vote. And the question is, in 2012, will you have a different group of people coming out?
Well, but as percentage of the population, it was.
Yes, but the question is, will those young people come out to vote in 2010 when the congressionals come up, when historically a president's party loses? We can have a great discussion about what that means.
But the point is, this may be a sort of one-time Obama phenomenon in a certain sense, in your view.
I think there are lots of things that have to go right to make sure that this is the kind of realignment that some people are looking for.
Of course.
David, what did the election mean?
Let me propose we take a long view and look at the series of elections that begins 20 years ago with the election of 1988. In 1988, the Republicans win a third presidential term in a row, a remarkable achievement, and they win it quite decisively, 53-46. That Republican victory rested on, there was one of the second last great triumph, the next was 1994, of the Nixon-Reagan coalition. And that was a coalition based on building together the traditional Republican strength in the educated middle and upper middle class, and adding to it a new base in what you can call, for lack of a better term, the working class, especially Northern Catholic, Southern Protestants. In 1988, according to the exit polls, which are not always perfectly reliable, the elder Bush beat Michael Dukakis in a whole series of categories, but the one I suggest we pay most attention, and it's interesting to people in the room, was among people with 4 years of higher education. According to the New York Times exit poll, the elder Bush beat Dukakis in that category by 25 points. Over the next 20 years, what we will see is the Republicans increasing their majority among their traditional, among that Nixon-Reagan working class base, to the point where they're getting over 60% of it, at the same time as their majorities among that 4-year educated group dwindle. They drop from 88 to 92, although those people go not to Clinton but to Perot. They don't come back in 1996, although Dole still wins among people with 4 years of higher education in 1996. George Bush wins in that group, but much more narrowly in 2000. He barely holds on in 2004. In 2008, that group goes slightly for Barack Obama. Even if you look only at whites with 4 years of higher education, John McCain does win that group, but very narrowly, by just a couple of points. And that is a group that is remarkably fast growing. As recently as 1990, only about 1 out of 5 American whites had a 4-year degree. Today, almost 1 in 3 does. There's a lot of attention in American politics to the bottom third of the electorate. I think that there are many reasons why you pay attention to that. Part of it is this very dramatic mass migration we've had from south of the border primarily. But I think there's another reason, which is that the party that has been becoming stronger and stronger and stronger, the Democratic Party, does not like to look in the mirror and understand the reasons for its success. It is very important for the democratic self-image, for Democrats to believe that they owe their triumphs in recent years to their ability to pull out greater support among minorities and among the young. And they have done well. But the truly decisive fact since 1988 is the migration of the upper fifth of the American electorate, not unanimously, but disproportionately from the Republicans to the Democrats. Now that raises to the question, that's what's happened. Now what does it mean? The most important question for Democrats is, can they hold that new educated voting base they have? Now, that educated voting base has moved from Republicans to Democrats for a constellation of reasons, but they can be summarized, I think, in this way. In the 1990s, Bill Clinton transformed the Democratic identity on economics from being the party of unions and protectionism and a backward-looking, nostalgic view of the American economy, the way they were in 1984 when Walter Mondale mocked the idea that the American economy could be based on silly things like software. Real countries made, steel. That Clinton modernized the Democratic approach on economics and made the Democratic Party acceptable to people who worked in the private productive economy. And then in the later part of the 1990s, the Republicans then drove that group away, partly by the social issues, partly by the Iraq misadventure, and partly because of the poor performance of the American economy for most people, not just in the crisis of 2007 and 2008, but pretty consistently through the Bush years. So that's the Democratic opportunity. The question is, having now gained the benefit of this opportunity, can Democrats use it? It seems to me that they have an option, they have a possibility of creating a truly realigning majority. But to do that, they would have to impose tremendous self-discipline on themselves. That is, to reaffirm the economics of the Clinton years and to jettison many of the approaches that Barack Obama has already legislated. What I think is the most interesting question is Barack Obama and today's Democrats are using their victory to try to do a much more ambitious, much more statist, much more redistributive agenda than Bill Clinton ever did. And we will see how that new cohort of Democratic voters responds. Let me say one last sentence, because I've already gone on too long. There are a couple of ways to simplify a little bit, to think about the way public opinion works in a democracy. One model is the public makes up its mind, and then there's an election, and the election reflects what the public wants, and that means that politicians have a mandate. Another way to think of it is that elections create opportunities for political leadership. That in 1980, the public rejects what the Democrats had been doing since the middle 1960s, and in 2008, the electorate rejects what the Republicans have been doing since the early 1980s. That's an opportunity. Now the question is, how do you use it? If you use it successfully, if you deliver results, then you get ratified. It's the ratifying election that is the one that is truly important. If, however, you deliver bad results, you do not get ratified, and then all the work up to that point goes for naught. So that's the question mark, I think, hanging over what happens in the next 4 years.
And would the ratifying election be 2010 or 2012?
It'll be both 2010 and 2012.
And presumably 2016, potentially, and onward. And
For the current president and the ambitious agenda he's put forward, I think we'll all be watching 2010 and 2012 as some indicator, because I think I agree that the elections is more of an opportunity. Leaders assume a mantle of mandate. Some do anyway. But it isn't necessarily the case that the American public is voting for all of the things that the president.
Well, there aren't very many presidents who've come to the presidency with as profound a set of failures and voter repudiations behind them as Barack Obama has, and in a moment of very unsettled domestic and foreign circumstances. And David is right that the migration of the higher educated, particularly in the coastal states, is a major part of what's happened to Democrats. It's a mistake not to realize that many working class people are people of color in this society now, and they are voting for the Democrats and turning out in higher ranks.
If this election had been among whites only, John McCain would have won.
But barely. All parties in America face a dilemma of bridging divides. The Democrats certainly face that. But I don't think there's any evidence in the public opinion so far or the voter behavior so far that people don't want fairly bold action on things like health care reform. So the idea that Obama could ratify this opportunity by acting like Bill Clinton in 1992 strikes me as really strange and not good advice for the Democrats to follow. Do they have to thread the needle about responding to a changing economy? Yes, but I think Obama, through all of this, before and after the election, has talked about this as a changing economy where we can't just recapitulate the strengths of the past. We've got to invest in new industries.
I'm not in the
and
business
new
of
ways
offering advice to
doing
Democrats,
things.
obviously.
Yes, you were.
No, I'm
Bad advice.
I'm offering an assessment that we can see the crucial decisions of the Obama presidency have already been made. We have this big stimulus package, that's done. We have the TARP, that's done. We have the mortgage bailout, that's nearly done. And then we have the extraordinary surge in governmental expenditure. Looming over the horizon are cap and trade and healthcare. We'll see
It's
what.
not that extraordinary, really, David. Come on now.
So what we are going to see is over the next few years a doubling of the national debt in relation to national income, and that's assuming that Obama's income numbers are good. It could be more than a doubling. Now, those things are going to have consequences for the way the American economy works. We're going to come out of the first Obama administration probably with a surge of economic activity, because these Keynesian measures do work in the short term, as Richard Nixon proved when he did them in the early 1970s. You can stimulate an economy out of recession that way. At the same time, you have a higher debt load. We are probably going to have a much more regulated economy, and we are going to have a much higher level of much bigger government, and therefore the implication of much higher taxes in the future. He will not be able to fund this state the way he's saying he's going to. So that is going to be a very different set of economic organization. Now, if that works, if that new way of economic organization delivers enduring prosperity, well then, you guys were right all along. If, however, it has the same consequences that it usually has had in history, then it's not going to work. And then we are going to see—
And what would those consequences be?
Slow down
the greatest prosperity in American history between the 1940s and the early 1960s, when tax rates were far above what anybody is talking about now.
We are going to— the usual consequences of rapid increases in government expenditure, which we didn't have between the 1940s and the 1960s.
We certainly did.
No, we had sorry, between 1945
You
and—
can have your opinions, but you can't have your
In 1945, the government spent 50%.
Let him finish, and
Theda,
then we'll go back.
In 1945, the government spent half the GDP. Right? In 1960,
We're talking about peacetime expenditures. They grew
1945.
in the
Sorry,
post-war
if you
period.
want to say you were comparing 45 to 65, we're looking at the chart. You can't say that government expenditure went up between 45 and 65.
Anybody can play those games.
It's
from
not a
the
game.
end
It's
of
a line.
war
Sorry,
to a peacetime.
sorry. I thought
Wait
you
a
told
minute.
Those
All
are
right, time out between the two of you. Time out between the two of you. Do you want to get in on this before I go on? Then I want to go on to something else. But if you want to, or Kathleen.
I would just want to urge the audience that this battle about the budget and the deficit is one worthy of its own panel and actually a whole class, semester or more. And it can't be summed up in the rapid fire, because there are real differences of views in both parties, what the facts are and what you conclude from those facts. I think all I will say is that in 1993, when Clinton was trying to pass what he thought was an ambitious budget, and the battle was between let's cut the deficit or increase spending, and the deficit cutters won, which only Democrats barely passed by one vote, and there was a huge dispute as to whether.
And the major social
Kathleen,
initiatives failed.
Can I go back actually to one other thing, unless you want to?
Let's do go back.
Okay, let me go back to one thing, because one of the things that I noticed that all of you talked about in this election is, maybe with the exception of you, Kathleen, is that I think all of you are saying that the election was decided, as I think most presidential elections are, by the underlying factors of whether it's David's long-term shift in educated voters, whether it's the economy being in crisis in the fall, and that therefore, for all of Barack Obama's personal popularity, for all that his personal story represents something ennobling or inspiring, that, do you all agree, probably any reasonable Democrat would have beaten any reasonable Republican?
Oh, I don't know.
No?
Go
The
ahead.
sentiment was so fiercely anti-Bush that there was a good shot for somebody with charm and charisma and intelligence. That didn't come out right. No, well, Obama has that.
All of which he has.
Of course he does. He does, and he's articulate, and he was a change, and I think that was a big part of it. But I wanted to say one thing about David's point about how whether the Republicans can bring back the educated class. And I would suggest that I'm going to now give Republicans some advice, and that is quit playing stupid.
Yeah. Not with what they're doing now. They're not going to bring it back.
It's beyond that. It's this whole populist drive against the intellectual class, against elitists and elitism. I love elites, you know, and conservatives love elites when it comes to the U.S. Marine Corps or the Navy SEALs, but for some reason we don't like academic elites. I hate elitism. I hate the attitude that somehow we're better than someone else because we've had good fortune in our lives and we've been lucky and we've had access to education and so on and so forth. But the Republicans have taken to playing on that resentment toward people who've got them dang PhDs, you know. And
There's an anti-intellectualism to the conservative movement.
Dang
Yeah.
is Southern for the F word, by the way.
There was also something in what David said about sort of 1 in 3 whites being having college educations and sort of the race piece to it. So I don't want to let go of that and just make this point, which is the lovely media in the election. I basically call them the hated media, but you know, when you're in the White House, you just basically don't like them. But there was a real sort of focus in the couple weeks after the election about sort of where whites voted and had whites, you know, whites, he got less percentage, et cetera, et cetera. And to me, I think it misses the point, which is this country is in fact demographically diverse. And it means that most elections from here on out, people to be elected president, you're going to have to talk to a number of different groups to get that majority, to get you in the White House, and frankly, to get you in the Senate or to get you in the House of Representatives.
Absolutely.
And that is something, from the way I look at it, is because we're reaching a point in which we will have no one majority, you really perhaps have an opportunity to cut across and really look at what do people fundamentally care about. On the other hand, I simply will point out that the state of California is my poster child for how we have completely failed to see the common interest in our insistence that we will not invest in our future workforce and instead build prisons. But that's another conversation.
That's on to the governor's race rather than the presidential race.
I don't think we should leave McCain entirely out of this. And I know you were getting at this in your question. I do think that any articulate, convincing Democrat would have won in the circumstances that prevailed after the economic collapse that occurred in the early fall. But this was a much more commanding victory than I think it had to be. And I think it was not just that Obama came across as likable, calm, in command to the American people, principally through the debates, by the way, which people watched very carefully. But I also think McCain blew it in terms of what he could have done. He made the Palin gamble, which was inauthentic and came across as inauthentic, and all the political science research cost him a lot in terms of his chances of living. But he also didn't square the internal contradictions he was dealing with inside the Republican Party. He needed to play to the independents in the middle. And that's a dilemma for the Republicans now. Once a party gets to be a regional minority party, and this happened to Democrats in earlier eras, they're tempted to play to their safe seats, to their most extreme partisans, and they start doing truly bizarre things. And of course I'm a Democrat, but I wish we had a credible alternative party. And I don't understand what those folks are doing. They're doing some very, very strange things. I mean, having the governor of Texas talking about secession, I mean, come on. That's not the way to get to a revived, and they're not listening to you.
David would agree. They want him to read his website.
But that's what David's trying to do. I mean, David is one of several apostates.
They're not going to listen to me now. That's okay. I know that better than you. I'm not in it for now.
No, I don't understand.
I'm in it for.
I was in your position in an earlier time.
I'm in it. I think one of the things that American politics is about, it's a series of appointments. You have meetings at various moments in history, and unlike European politics, people talk about how the Americans have the permanent campaign. Every democracy has a permanent campaign. The difference between the United States and Britain, in Britain, you know who the leaders are, you just don't know when the election will be. In America, you know when the election will be, you just don't know who the leaders are. So there's an appointment in November of 2010, and they're not going to listen to me then. And there's an appointment in November 2012, and I highly doubt they will listen to me then. But they will listen to me between 2012 and 2014, and if not between 2012 and 2014, then certainly between 2014 and 2016. And I eat right and I wear seatbelts, so I plan to be there. But look, this goes back to this question about Obama and McCain. Obama, I basically agree that barring a catastrophic mistake, there was nothing that John McCain could have done to win the election, nothing that any Republican who was likely to be nominated could have done to win the election. But there were things that the Democratic nominee could have done to lose the election. That was possible in those last 6 or 8 weeks. That if a Democrat had mishandled the crisis, I think there was an opportunity to lose. And I am not sure that Hillary Clinton would not have stumbled into that opportunity, because I think she just doesn't have it in her fingertips. There's a kind of, that being a great politician is more like being a great artist than it is like being a great intellectual. A lot of it is knowing without even being able to tell people how you know what you know. So the great politicians, the Roosevelts, the Reagans, will see Barack Obama, but more Barack Obama than Hillary Clinton. They just have a kind of feeling in their fingertips of what to do. They know it before the polls come in. He projected what the country wanted to see most, which is calm, reassurance, and the certainty that I have a plan. No one was quite interested in what the plan was, especially since it was obvious that John McCain had no plan or 9 plans, which is even worse. Now that said, having established his authority with that kind of presentation of calm and in command, he now has to deliver that kind of presidency. And what we're seeing is a presidency of very big gambles. And I don't think that economics as we know it suggests these gambles are going to work. They will work in the short run. I have no doubt that the stimulus will work in the way John Maynard Keynes promised when he said, in the long run, we are all dead. What he meant is, in the short run, these things work. But if in 2014 and 2015 we have 7% inflation, if in 2014, 2015, the dollar is trading at a big discount to the euro, if we see that the economy is growing not at the 3.5% that it grew between 1995 and 2005, but at the 2% that was the norm in the 1970s, if youth unemployment remains high because there are a lot of barriers to hiring new employees, there's a lot more regulation and a lot more unionization, I think at that point he will have a big problem, because the country voted for a solution. They didn't vote for a specific plan. They voted to make things better. So your responsibility is to make things better. And he's doing some things that will work in the short run, but he's using this moment to make a lot of changes that are very different from the Clinton economic agenda, and are therefore, since they're different policies from Bill Clinton's, are going to have different results from Bill Clinton's.
I can't let go. What percentage of, what barrier in unionization exists when we have less than 7%?
Where we'll be in 2015.
We'll have a level of unionization that will be barriers for young people to be employed?
If we do. Held our own in unionization.
If we do, and other kinds of regulatory measures. If you have, for example, much higher minimum wages. There are a lot of things you can do to regulate where you protect, and this is the way it works in Europe. You protect insiders at the expense of outsiders, and that is what.
So two things, just quickly, two things.
If that doesn't happen, if he doesn't do it, then it won't have the results. If he does do it,
wait a minute, Theda, Maria, and then we'll go to Theda.
The facts are the private sector is 7 or 8% unionization. Okay, it's incredibly low. And there are innumerable academic studies as to the fact that raising the minimum wage does not in fact.
There are no good ones. There's one,
Okay.
but look,
Well,
we're going to have a bigger public sector, and that's where unionization is strong. If we have a much bigger federally subsidized transportation sector, which we may, I mean, if these high-speed rail lines are built, and if they are done, and if they have a lot of public sector employees, there will be a higher level of unionization. And public sector unionization matters to the overall life chances of young people too.
Okay, we've all agreed that Obama came into office in the midst of what is an obvious crisis. The American system is rigged against substantial domestic policy achievements normally, and usually those achievements come in the face of crisis. The New Deal being an example, the Great Society after Kennedy's assassination, and so forth. So is the stage set for Obama to have a truly consequential, substantial presidency of domestic policy achievement? David, you've sort of said the key decisions have already been made, but Theda, you have advocated a more ambitious agenda, certainly. Is this the kind of crisis situation that can lead to the rare burst of substantial domestic policy achievement, or?
Let's get something straight. I mean, what I'm talking about is not all that ambitious. It's recognizing that there have been profound deteriorations in access to opportunity and basic security, not just for the working class, but for most of the population who aren't in the top fifth over the last period. There is broad public support, far ahead of Washington and public opinion, for addressing the issue of health security and controlling costs in the healthcare system. The stage is set for, and Obama's tactics are subtle and deft and designed to avoid many of the mistakes of the 1,342-page Clinton plan that I carry into my classes to show how big and incomprehensible it was. But will this initiative, and this is probably the most important one that's coming up soon beyond the economic recovery measures, will it get through Congress without being gutted by a whole series of special interests? People act as if the debate in America is between big government and the market. That debate about big government was conceded by the so-called conservatives long ago. What they want in the Republican Party and parts of the Democratic Party, in my opinion, is big government that hands out guaranteed profits, regulatory advantages, and all kinds of opportunities for special perks to the privileged interests. And these privileged interests are not all Republicans. Many of them are inside the Democratic Party in the Senate. One little example, higher education finance. Obama is proposing to cut the guaranteed profits handed to banks for simply passing through public money to loans for students and use the savings to fund more Pell Grants and publicly offered loans to lower class and middle class students. That's an important challenge for this country because access to higher education has deteriorated steadily for the last 20 years in a country that was the world leader in combining excellence and opportunity in higher education. But he's facing opposition, not so much from the Republican Party, which is off talking about succession. He's facing opposition from Democratic senators tied to those bankers who want those guaranteed profits. That's just one of many examples, and I don't know whether he'll be able to overcome that opposition if we continue to have a political system in which not just a majority, but 60 votes are required to do anything of any significance in our democracy.
You would not say that substantial health care reform is an ambitious agenda? It seems to me it's pretty ambitious.
I do not think it is at all ambitious in relationship to the deteriorating situation and the rising costs. The boldest things that happen, and this was true of the New Deal of the 1930s, are often reassertions of long-standing values in the face of deteriorating circumstances. Obama is a master of that. He is not some wild-eyed radical, either in his personal style or in the way he talks about values. He is looking for a way to reinvent an America of opportunity and broad security. And it's a reinvention. It's not some wild departure from our best traditions.
Well, it feels like a reinvention, though.
Oh, wait a minute. Let Kathleen.
Well, I mean, it does feel like a reinvention, and Republicans have their own, they have their constituents and they have their legitimate concerns about raising taxes, increasing spending, building debt. I mean, these are big, major concerns, and we don't really know where it leads. I mean, the bottom line, anytime I ask anyone, and I talk to economists and people in Congress, I say, but this model, if we project into the future, I mean, somebody sort of figured it out, right? It's going to work, and how we're going to end up in such and such a place. And the answer is always, well, nobody really knows. I mean, nobody really knows how it's going to turn out. So it could turn out badly. And, Republicans do have alternative ideas, which are worth debate.
What are they?
Well, I mean, just as an example, yeah. No, I hear you. I mean, on health, they're going to have a plan next month, right? But philosophically, they have an ideal, which is that why not go, instead of rebuilding this healthcare system and having this government insurance policy, why not have, why not involve ourselves in entitlement reform and try to reduce the cost of health by, for example, limiting defensive medical procedures. I mean, things like that are alternatives. In principle, I don't know, but again, I mean, who knows? I'll just give you one example. My own recent experience, this is, I can't give you statistics, but I can tell you that I went to the doctor, I had an electrocardiogram. They said, oops, you're going to have a heart attack. I said, oh, really, when? And they said, anytime now, we're going to put you in an ambulance, put you in the hospital. I said, well, can I get my husband to come pick me up? They said, yes, but you can't leave the office. They put me in the hospital. The doctor comes and says, they were going to do a catheterization first thing in the morning. So they tortured me all night, you know how they do, taking my blood and checking my pulse and blah, blah, blah. The doctor said, let's just do a stress test first. Let's go easy on this. The stress test showed, yeah, your heart is weird, but that's normal for you. They sent me home. So I was in the hospital for less than 24 hours. The cost of my hospital bill was $9,000. All they did was take my temperature, take my blood, wake me up every hour, and put me on a treadmill. So something's wrong there.
Oh, that's why Obama's talking about controlling costs. He recognizes that.
Go ahead, David.
But this may be, in a presidency with a lot of gambles, this may be the biggest gamble yet that Obama is making. Because his health, we don't have his health plan yet, but his health concepts want to do two things. He wants to extend insurance to include most, if not all, of the currently uninsured, some tens of millions of people, maybe 40 million people, maybe more. At the same time, all of his projections all are predicated on the idea that he is going to be able to slow the increase in healthcare costs and by some very dramatic numbers. Now, back in the 80s, David Stockman used to have this thing called the magic asterisk. Whenever there was a problem with the Reagan budget, you'd put an asterisk there, and the asterisk said savings to be identified. And that's the, but in the Reagan years, in the Reagan years, that the magic asterisk was talking about amounts in the billions and tens of billions of dollars. Obama's magic asterisks are for hundreds of billions and half trillions of dollars over the next 5 and 10 years. So when I suggest, not advise Democrats, but when I suggest that they're on a plan that is going to lead to much lower productivity growth, higher inflation, and lower job opportunities, those are the kinds of huge numbers that are hanging over the American economy. I think I can probably guess how Obama will reconcile those contradictions. And it's not completely impossible that it will work. But there's a third element of the healthcare problem, which I think does complicate it, which is that one of the other things he's sort of implicitly promised to people is, yes, it's going to be more widely available, and it's not going to cost much more. In fact, it's going to cost less, and it's going to be no worse in quality. And that last element is the one that is going to be the hardest to deliver. And if, again,
Not really, because a lot of procedures are wasteful.
when it's your
afraid of being sued, so he put me in the hospital.
Exactly,
for things
and
that
you're
were
insured.
necessary.
when it's
And
when
I'm
it's
insured.
your heart that is maybe having the attack, and they say this procedure is probably wasteful and therefore we won't do it.
Do you know how many people face that circumstance and die?
It's going to be a lot more.
What would you do about the 45 million uninsured, David?
I think that
Or
you,
what would your party do?
I think the Republican answer, and the Republicans don't have a good answer to this because
they don't.
They don't.
Oh, wait, let him answer.
The Republican answer begins by trying to reinstitute market disciplines through the healthcare system by bringing together the place where the money is paid and the place where the decision is made. And if for example you were John McCain and this was not a plan, it was just a concept. That was one of the things that did him in. But his idea of a tax credit that would basically cash out what your employer is giving you now and put that money into your hands to allow you to begin to make choices and then to encourage, I like some of the ideas that Bob Bennett of Utah has, to encourage insurance companies to try to sign up people one by one rather than employers one by one. That offers hope, only hope, of instituting market discipline. What Obama's
We've
going to
already tried stuff like that, and it really doesn't, because healthcare markets don't work like
But what
other
Obama's
markets.
going to rely on instead is the monopsonistic power of government to do this from the center. He has to. There's no way that, I mean, it's the only way that makes sense of all the things he says he wants to do. And that is going to put Americans on a course where some Americans will benefit. Some people will get better health care, but others will get worse. And the group that will get worse are the people where the Democrats have made the biggest gains in recent years.
Yeah, let Maria get in.
I just want to say on the healthcare piece, full disclosure, I represent a couple of health insurance companies. So I will simply say this. One of the reasons that we're in the bind that we are, which is we have a very built-up employer-based system, is actually unionization. Because when unions had sufficient density, employers, they insisted on health care and retirement, and employers started to offer, and non-union employers offered the same in order to compete. So we've built up an employer-based system, and yet we've now reduced unionization. That's a different issue. And so it means we can't start from scratch, right? And we've certainly learned from 1994 that the 1,000-page isn't going to work. So it is a challenge for how do you bridge, how do you move to an individual mandate in a way that doesn't disrupt what's already there, but in fact increases the coverage, reduces costs, and ensures quality. This is not an easy, and part of it is in our market-based, employer-based, for-profit system, we ended up devising a system that reimbursed on the basis of activity. Every doctor visit, every procedure, every operation, every hospitalization. So there are perverse incentives built in that add up to the cost. So we've got to figure out how to take that out without sacrificing quality.
Make a profit in the present system by excluding sick people.
Right.
And it is very important to keep in mind that after 15 years of an imperfect start, Medicare does a better job of controlling costs and delivering quality care per dollar than most of the private employer health insurance system does at this time. I don't think any of this is easy. I really agree that it's not easy. I don't think how to pay for it is as big a problem as David does, but part of the answer is to return the contribution that privileged Americans like all of us sitting at this table are making through our taxes to roughly the level it was under Ronald Reagan. That's part of the answer, and I would like to see that answer put out first before we start talking about all of the other things. And Barack Obama was amazing in the last election because he's the first national politician who consistently talked about the need to ask for greater tax contributions from the wealthy and did not run for cover at the first whiff of complaint in the media.
If you watched the Sunday morning shows this Sunday, you saw David Gregory trying to ask Larry Summers, will you guarantee that there will be no tax increase on the bottom 95%? And that question was asked to Larry Summers 3 different times.
It's not Larry Summers' job to answer questions like that.
No, except the problem is if you know Larry, you can see he knows the answer to that question. And with his brilliant mathematical mind, which is he's a mathematical mind, not a verbal mind, as he struggled to find some way not to answer that question in a way that betrayed that he knew that the answer to the question, you are not going to fund what Barack Obama wants to do with the level of tax increase that he's talking about.
Wait a minute, Theda.
Barack Obama has cut taxes on the bottom.
Stop. Let Maria go, and then Kathleen, go ahead.
I just want to go to this point about broader community and value, because underlying this battle we're having in ideology, one of the things we need to recognize that over the last 40 years, starting with the Reagan presidency, was a heightened focus on individualism. And I think a destruction of a sense of community. It's reached a point where you can have someone who's making $80,000 a year, right? $120,000 a year, who says, the government doesn't do anything for me. It only worries about the very rich or the very poor. And so I don't want my taxes increased. To which I had to say to this sister of mine, oh, by the way, who paid for your college education at UCLA? Because California 25 years ago, actually had a system in which we taxed each other to have the best university system, the best state college system, the best community college system, as well as K through 12. So we've destroyed our sense of community, and it's a challenge as to whether one president can help restore that.
You want to wait a minute. Before we go on to something else, wait a minute. Time out just a second. Before we go on to something else, Kathleen, do you want to jump in on this?
Well, no, I'm from the South, so we never interrupt.
Okay. Sorry. I want to go back to
Wait. All she said was she didn't want to interrupt, and then she got cut off, the poor woman.
Wait a second. That ideological statement with the fact that President Obama's plans.
We'll go. No, just a moment. David, wait a second.
The only thing I was going to say, I was going to agree with David.
What has he said that you're agreeing with?
Well, I think the taxes are going to go up for everyone in the second term, in Obama's second term, because, by the way, all of us baby boomers are going to, all of us, assuming that we don't have to keep working forever, they're going to be retiring in vast numbers, and we simply can't afford not to raise taxes on everyone. And that the understanding among those who know such things is that in the second term, assuming there is one, and presumptively there is, we're all going to be paying more taxes.
You know, it's a very different thing if the first thing that happens is that the very wealthy who have escaped taxes increasingly start paying their share, and then others are asked to pitch in. And it's a very different thing, and Americans, I've studied this, come on, Americans will support paying taxes for programs we all have a stake in. And the example is Social Security. Right. And when average income Americans say, government hasn't paid much attention to me, they've paid much more attention to the very rich and the very poor, they're right on the whole.
They are right.
President Obama does not believe with you because
he wants to change what government does.
Because if he did, he would not say the contrary, which is what he's been saying for the past
No. He has never said that he won't raise taxes in his second term. He's never said
Well,
that.
he's going to get his programs in place, and people presumably will be happy enough with them that they'll be willing to cough it up.
All right, wait a minute.
But he's not telling
before we move on to one other thing, thank you, Maria. I was just about to go to foreign policy, but before we do that, for those of you who have questions, please hand them down to the end of the row. We have some people who are going to be coming through collecting those, and then they'll be brought up here, and we'll ask a few of these at the end. But okay, let's. The one word we haven't said, or the two words we haven't said, is foreign policy. I think that would have been astonishing a year before the election, when it seemed that Iraq would be the determining factor in George Bush's unpopularity and in the struggle of the Republican Party. So we get to a president, Barack Obama, who in some ways was elected in the midst of a crisis in foreign policy as well as domestic policy, and who was elected surely to some degree because of unpopular foreign policies by his predecessor. Let me just ask a sort of general question. How has he done so far in beginning to address that? And I guess specifically with Iraq, is his pledge He's now saying he's going to leave 50,000 troops there for an indefinite period of time, but meet his promise of 16 months for everybody else. Is that good enough? Is he doing what he has to do to resolve Iraq in a sufficient way to make him, to avoid the unpopularity of George Bush? David, you want to?
For me, the two biggest surprises to date in the Obama presidency are how much more to the left on domestic policy he's been than I thought he would be, and how much less to the left he has been on foreign policy than I thought he would be. And indeed, that it looks more and more like that the first 2 years of the Obama administration foreign policy are going to look a lot like the last 2 years of the Bush administration. I mean, he is on Iraq, he is about probably where John McCain would have been. Our strategy on Iraq has been to sort of pocket the surge, take an optimistic view. Both Obama and McCain agreed on that, and to draw down the forces to about that 50,000 level. I think neither Republican nor Democratic president would have had an early strike at the Iranian nuclear facility. I think they both would have agreed that a John McCain administration would have re-intensified the effort to engage Iran diplomatically, and certainly that's what Barack Obama is going to do. I don't think he'll be very successful, but he will then face some very difficult decisions, but probably not for 18 months to 2 years. I think we see the Cuba policy collapsing of its own weight. That I'm amazed it's lasted as long as it has. I don't think it's a big symbolic concession to important ideological forces in the Democratic Party, but it's really more of a symbolic issue than a pragmatic one. And I think that it looks looks like what I expected to see in the domestic field and didn't see.
And I would say no. On substance, basically you're right, but there is and you probably did some foreign trips, and so there is something that happens at the foreign leader level. And as you engage in these meetings, that many of us would say, is this, symbolism, or, why is this important? But it matters to them. And there is a fundamental difference in the way Barack Obama talks to the world about what America's role is, that says to the world, you are one of us, not this solitary, unitary actor. Now, at the end of the day, he's expanding the strikes at the border, Afghanistan, Pakistan. And I say, God bless him, you know why? Because Pakistan is having trouble controlling the terrorists, and that is going to be the source of our problem. I'd rather be focused there than in Iraq. So, yes, substance, maybe more or less. But on style, which matters in this arena, it is a new day.
You were both nodding when she talked about a difference in symbolism and style.
Yeah.
There's a difference in tone.
Oh, no question about it. And, I feel like his first foray out into the great big world has been, there have been some ups and some downs, yes. Yes. I think he needs a new chief of protocol to explain a few things about bowing and handshakes and such.
And what kind of gifts?
What kind of gifts to give. The Bush attitude was, well, here's an example of how different. George Bush would never utter the word Chavez, period. He would not acknowledge his existence, because to acknowledge his existence was to validate him and to give him status. Now that's one approach to foreign policy. But then I'm not sure the yo brother, solidarity handshake is quite the way to go either. As for Cuba, I've written for years that I think we ought to lift the embargo. It's not served any purpose for so long, it's ridiculous. And so talking is good, I think, but I've tried to come up with what is Obama's style, and I think I can say this in this auditorium with this group. I think he's Cassius Clay. Float like a butterfly. And we'll see if he can sting like a bee, but he's a practical man.
He's already shown that he can sting like a bee. Look what he did with that pirate thing.
He did kill 3 teenagers. That'll do it
He
every time.
authorized the killing of 3 teenagers, and that's, fine with me. I think that the only thing I would add to what everybody said, and I kind of agree with it, is that I wouldn't underestimate the degree to which, on the international stage as well as domestically, Obama impresses by his sheer intelligence. It's not just that he's got a cool cat demeanor. And I thought it was fascinating in the election to watch most of the American populace quietly come to the conclusion that a nice guy who was stubborn and not too smart was not such a great idea. And there's a cyclical nature in presidential politics where people turn from what has failed before to the new. And one of the things that Obama brought in a timely way was his intelligence, but also his biography that symbolizes a willingness to open to the world. And that's another side of America. But I think the guy is a muscular liberal. It didn't surprise me what he did afterwards, because I thought he was clear during the campaign that he was going to draw down probably a little more gradually than he'd said in the primary from Iraq. Don't underestimate how difficult it is to withdraw from a war, short of some, signing ceremony on a carrier. This is a remarkable thing that he's doing. Keeping Gates on was an important part of that. Putting Hillary Clinton in there to help deal with a lot of this stuff, brilliant move. It's a tough world, but he has opened up the rest of the world to partnerships with America on a series of issues that will not be solved without partnerships. That's a big change. It creates opportunity. It doesn't create certainty. The times are fraught. We don't know if it's going to work.
David, you were smiling. Does the change in tone make a difference, or do you think there is a change in tone?
Well, look, I think there is a pressing of the reset button, and I think that's to America's advantage. I want to pick up, I think, one thing about the Hugo Chavez. The treatment of Hugo Chavez is actually one of the most signal successes of the Bush years. Because Hugo Chavez takes power in the late 1990s in a series, he comes to power in 2 bites, and he sets himself to provoke a confrontation with the United States. He needs that confrontation desperately. Now, there was one bad day in Venezuela policy where there was an attempted coup, and for a little less than 24 hours, the United States looked like it might countenance that coup. That policy was slapped down. Was that?
It probably sponsored that.
They certainly did not. I know. They certainly did not. I know that they did not. But there was a moment of uncertainty as to whether to countenance or not, and the person who talked about countenancing was immediately fired. So that looks very much like an initiative by one mid-level person in the State Department, and he lost his job over it. For the rest of the 8 years, Bush refused to bite. And Chavez provoked him with it because he wanted to be the next Castro, because he's running disastrous economic policies inside Venezuela. He needs an enemy, and George Bush refused to provide him with that. So refusing to say his name, that wasn't childish. That was saying, leave me out of this. The people of Venezuela, this is your problem, not America's.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, that's what he said.
I don't think the gestures toward Chavez were for Venezuela or about Chavez. They're part of a choreography of resetting the relation to the whole world that Obama is doing. He has vast support from the American people for doing this. And one of the things I can't understand is why we get so hung up on exactly what words are said to the leaders of countries that are no threat, that are tiny.
I hope Benjamin Netanyahu gets as big a smile and as firm a handshake as Hugo Chavez just did.
Well, I don't think he will.
Well, that's pretty bad.
Unless he delivers. If he delivers, he'll get a big smile.
Smiles for people who don't like us and frowns for people who do?
That's not what foreign policy is about. Come on.
It's not just about liking the
We
U.S.
write checks to the Israelis.
Yeah, big ones.
We're not going to be writing checks to
Venezuela.
So the point is, we will smile at Chavez and we won't smile at Netanyahu. That's what I was afraid of.
Well, David, I'm just sort of hoping that this is just the first round where Obama's actually introducing himself to the world. And then you regroup and you figure out what your strategy is.
I think this is a guy you don't cross.
And that's what I'm hoping, but I spend a lot of time hoping.
There's no evidence that anybody gets away with crossing Obama. He is surprisingly tough.
Well, David
I wouldn't
Axelrod.
underestimate him.
Well, nobody's doing that.
I would just say that it's still less than 100 days. Today is 100 days?
There is that.
Today
isn't
is
there?
3 months, 90
3
days.
months, 90 days.
We're cheating a
So
little.
we're 10 days short.
Yeah.
It's still relatively soon. So there's a lot.
Sure.
You know, every president walks in, and every day you don't know when it's going to hit you.
Well, and he's
We'll
brand
see.
new. He's
We'll see.
brand.
He's
I mean,
brand new.
he's getting to know the landscape.
Exactly.
And he's, you know, we've made fun of his listening tour, but in a sense, he's checking it out. You know, he's trying to
This-
figure out.
This guy
Kinda
is
who's what.
masterful. I'm sorry, I don't think this was a failure, this world tour, and
Oh, I don't think so.
see this at all. He's masterful, and
said
the only
that?
other thing I would say is I think we should be as patient as most Americans say they're prepared to be. Washington and the media want everything today.
Yes.
This is much more like the 1930s. This is going to play out over 8 to 12 years. I do agree with David that there'll be a changed Republican Party by the end of it. But there's also going to be several movements within the Obama administration and the Democratic Party. And I don't mean the kind of Clinton turmoil where people are thrown out the door and you switch to a new policy the next day. And I liked the Clintons, but come on. There's much more steadiness in the Obama administration, but there's going to be a series of transformations. And the country is in an economic crisis it is not going to get out of in the short run.
I would say, I mean, you're absolutely right. The level of challenges where people are writing about it over and over. The fact is that we won't be able to get out of the economic crisis we're in solely within our borders. It is a worldwide, and it has to do with transforming an economy where developing countries, frankly, have millions and millions of people who are willing to be the low-wage manufacturers for the rest of the world. And so the question for the United States is what kind of economy and what kind of investments in its human capital is it prepared to make to be competitive with a China that has 500 million people to waste, and India that has 500 million people in poverty.
Well, they're also educating those people increasingly.
But they've
As
got
former graduate dean, I can tell you.
But they're educating some of them, but they have enough of them.
They have a lot.
We, with 300 million, are doing actually a very, very poor job of educating the ones we have. And so that's the we don't have the manufacturing jobs that a high school grad could go and make a good living. They're not coming back. So this is profound transformation in the economy that, I don't care how smart he is going to require years, but also an acceptance by the American public that it's prepared to make some of these tough choices.
But
And
notice he's been telling Americans that, and the opinion polls show that they're listening so far.
Okay, let's go to some questions from the audience. And the first question is actually kind of a first. It's David Frum, would you teach at Berkeley? I don't know if we've had that question for a Republican before. Wow, you've won over Berkeley. Anyway.
Was that a promise or a threat, I wonder?
He would be a good choice.
The first question goes back to the bailout plan, back to the economic crisis, which we talked about briefly, but didn't go into in great detail. And there's kind of an interesting political question here. Will bailing out the banks, both directly and through the back door, and one might say not just banks, but beyond banks, bleed out political support, fiscal and political support for Obama's reform policies?
Maybe.
Yeah.
It's one of the risks, and if I to believe the New York Times, the latest squiggle on this is that they're going to convert the loans into common stock, and they're looking for one clever way after another to inject more capital into those banks without going back to Congress. Congress would not pass another big bailout now.
That's true.
And there is a real risk that the things that are necessary to do to coax Wall Street back into flowing the credit will completely alienate the heartland of the country, and it's already underway.
I would just, and there's this troubling issue, I think, for Americans who are struggling to hold on to their jobs, which is, you have Goldman Sachs declare a $1.8 billion profit and also really anxious to get out of the TARP in order to not have restrictions on its executive compensation. And it just feels like nothing's really changed.
Well, because
and so that's
Right.
gonna cause some resentment, I think.
Oh, I think it already is.
The card said foreign policy. Was that the end of the card? Was that the last phrase on the card?
No.
No.
Reform policies.
Reform policy.
Okay, because if there is an immediate threat, I think there are a lot of ways the Obama presidency can go wrong, but probably the earliest and most dramatic is this. There are differences of opinion about how big the bank problem is. The Obama administration chose a low-end estimate. Because that meant that the amount of money that had basically already been approved, plus the same amount again, would be sufficient, and you could then pass their big, ambitious programs on health care and other things through the Congress. If it turns out that that low-end number was wrong, and that the extent of the problem was not $1.5 trillion, but $3 trillion, and that they have launched themselves onto a spending path that precludes finding another $1.5 trillion to deal with this problem. We could have, like Japan, these walking dead banks that can't be killed but can't be brought back to life. And if we have 2 and 3 and 4 years of sluggish growth, the way they did in Japan after their crisis, I think that means that the future gets very cloudy for the Obama administration.
Well, I think that's right.
This is a question tailor-made for David, more serious than the first one. Is the Republican Party out of ideas for an American future? If not, what is the new vision? This is your website,
yes.
David. This is your book.
That's right. I would say
I want to hear about the vision.
yes, the Republican Party is.
Theda wants to know how to attack it.
I want to know what the new vision is. I just want to know what it is.
Okay, the Republican Party is out of ideas after an amazing run. I mean, American politics is very generational. People come in in their youth. Generations have experiences, like the generation of the students in this room. You have a generational experience. People who came of age between 1980 and 1988 are the most conservative and the most Republican cohort in the whole electorate. They had an experience that stamped them, and they came through from their teachers. They brought these ideas with them, as you will, through their life, and they then spent 20 years, and a lot of those ideas were put into place, not all of them, and the results were pretty dramatic. The American economy of 1995 was a much more successful and competitive economy than the American economy of 1975 or 1980. So that was a moment, but your inventory runs short. And the great deregulatory, tax-cutting burst of energy, the new approach to domestic policy, summed up by the Rudy Giuliani techniques to suppress crime in New York City, by welfare reform, which have transformed American social policy in American cities. These things, they were done, and they're complete, and they've had their result. And after that, parties go fallow. I think the way that the Democrats really went fallow after the middle 1960s. So we are going to have a period of incubation and growth. I have my own personal views. I lay them out in my book as to what that future is going to look like. And I'm a participant in that battle. I'm not going to do advertisement here for my particular vision, but it is going to be the work of a lot of people over the next half dozen years to say, we solved a lot of problems between 1978 and 1994, and when those problems are solved, they're retired. You don't get any victory laps. I often tell Republican audiences they didn't re-elect Winston Churchill in order to say thank you. They won't re-elect you.
And all those things that were done, and not all by Republicans, bear no responsibility for the incredible meltdown that has occurred in an economy that transferred an extraordinary amount of profit to the financial sector. That created uncontrolled speculation. That has taken the 401ks of people who have worked their whole life and shrunk them to practically nothing.
I wouldn't look. I think that is the nature. The reason that these generations come to an end is because every set of ideas has in it also the seeds of its own destruction and its own flaws. So when Franklin Delano Roosevelt tackled the Great Depression with a series of social democratic measures that had a lot of positive impacts on American life in the 40s and 50s. He also laid the seeds for the stagflation and the collapse of American competitiveness that happened in the 1970s. So our good ideas, they did a lot of good things, and they had some faults built in. They did contribute to the growth in inequality. They did make it difficult to cope with and respond to the surge in immigration that I think has been a big social problem for the United States. And they did let loose the creative deregulation of the financial sector in the 1970s, which made capital available in the 1980s and 1990s for a lot of enterprises. I mean, I don't have to tell people in California about this. Back the joke used to be that the thing that made America the greatest country in the world was it was the only place we could borrow $100 million without owning a suit. So that financial liberalization that put an end to the days when the government literally regulated the interest rates paid on checking accounts and made it a serious crime to own a gold coin. That, like all human things, people kept doing it until it went too far. And that's how you know it's time to stop, because you look at what's happened since 2001, and clearly what was creative and productive in the 80s and 90s has become excessive and destructive. So it will be reined back, just as Ronald Reagan came along to rein back the excesses of the Roosevelt and Johnson initiatives.
But will Republicans take some responsibility for the reining back? Because I'm not seeing that so far. Or is just the upside that you're talking
No, I think what will happen, just as it was very hard for Tip O'Neill to see that there was anything wrong with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, that Franklin Delano Roosevelt did, but Gary Hart could see it. So you will see that the people who were there will not say that there was anything wrong with what happened on Wall Street between 2002. The Republicans did pass these measures. A lot of Democrats were in favor of them too.
That's true.
We will look back, though, in 2014 and 2016, and if we have a reasonable response to the crisis, not a Sarbanes-Oxley, shoot all the wounded, but something pragmatic, and if it works, that will be absorbed and digested by the American political system. I mean, that the romantic era of the investment bank has been punctured. I mean, that people are going to say that you have to have more control of leverage. If you're playing with other people's money, there are reasons why we have always had rules on that in this country. First at the state level, then at the federal level. Now we'll have more rules.
I'd like to offer, as we go into this brand new world, do you think we could get Republicans and conservatives to think of the notion that perhaps wealth without work might not be a good thing?
It's the most American idea.
Right, where we value work, but somehow over the last 30 years, making money without really working for it?
Well, or worse than that, making money when you've messed up.
I think that's a pretty
universal
human desire, actually.
Well, raising taxes.
Well, maybe,
on
but
work.
it's not an American idea.
Let Kathleen jump in
Yeah.
here for a second.
It's actually midnight for me, so I'm this is my incoherent period. But no, I mean, raising taxes on working people is no way to incentivize work. But I was going to try to go back. I'm always wanting to go backwards. Have you noticed that? But I was hung up on this thought when you asked David what the vision for the Republican Party was. I just want to throw in another piece of that. And that is that, within the Republican Party, there's this great skirmish right now as to how they're going to define themselves socially and culturally. And I do think that they're going to have to back off of these very divisive cultural, social issues as litmus tests for their leaders. You simply can't insist that the only person who can lead your party has to absolutely be pro-life. There has to be room for people who have different points of view. This is going to be a bloodbath, by the way, which is a terrible image in that context. But and the religious element within that now sort of dominates the conversation so often when we talk about these issues has to be toned down. I think people see that, and that's beginning to happen, but there's going to be a great deal of resistance. And the demographics are such in this country, with the younger people putting less importance on, for example, same-sex marriage, or less importance on, or there just simply isn't a consensus that we should reverse Roe v. Wade. So if the Republican Party insists on cleaving to those issues as tightly as they have, I don't think they have much of a future.
And the other one I would add would be, I was struck by David's comment that the surge in immigration as a social problem. If the Republican Party doesn't find a way in which We can talk about immigration and what we need to control. We absolutely need to control the system in a way that makes sense and in a way that doesn't demonize. But that's another area that, given the demographics, I think Latinos in particular are ready-made Republicans.
Oh, absolutely.
But the Republicans are doing a really good job of pushing them away. And so thank God for that. We're working hard to keep them on the Democratic side. But
well, they've fostered this sort of us versus them mentality that is never going to build the constituency. Their base is going to wither of lack of attention and nurturing.
Right.
Two more questions. The first questioner wins the award for brevity. It's one word: environment. We haven't said anything about environmental issues. Again, kind of interesting that this is sort of like the fact that we didn't get to Iraq for a long time. It wasn't that long ago that global warming was the issue of the day. In this forum, that's true. So is there room for the Obama administration to address these kinds of issues? They're often expensive to do. Does the fiscal crisis prohibit it?
Not only is there room, and it's an absolute necessity. And I think the young people, and that I'm putting a lot of hope in that next generation, as providing and building the political space to make the hard decisions that need to be made. I understand that there is a minority view as to who's causing global warming. But there is, even if you don't believe global climate change, there is something about the unfettered use of resources that ought to just make us all stop and think. And so I think there will be some opportunities.
I think that last remark actually shows the tremendous opportunity that the environment is for Republicans. I mean, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this over the past couple of years, and I accept the danger of taking all of this carbon that was accumulated in solid form over hundreds of millions of years, and in the space of less than a century, turning it into gas and putting it up in the atmosphere. I don't know that I buy all of the projections, and I think that one of the things this issue has suffered from is Al Gore's terrible propensity to exaggerate, and that means that he's left a lot of hostages to fortune. But is it dangerous? Yes. Now, is this an issue? It's an enormous issue. One of the things that is striking to me about the Obama administration is that given opportunities to resolve this issue in ways that are market-oriented and inexpensive, they consistently opt for the least market-oriented and most expensive. Let me dramatize this in one way. If you want to reduce the amount of carbon in the atmosphere that we're putting in the atmosphere, that comes primarily from this tremendous use of coal for electricity. About half of America's electricity comes from coal. A kilowatt hour of electricity from coal costs about 3.5 cents. Now, say you don't want to do that anymore. You think, we have to reduce this, is dangerous. The rational thing to do is say, let us look for the next cheapest alternative that doesn't emit carbon. And those are two: hydropower and nuclear power. Two energy sources that are never mentioned in the president's speeches. They cost about 5 cents a kilowatt hour. Instead, he again and again averts to wind and solar. Those cost 10 times as much as coal. They are the most expensive possible sources of electricity. And that's why he rules out the carbon tax, which is the cheapest way of solving this problem, in favor of cap and trade, because only a cap and trade system can conceal how very expensive the energy sources the president wants to favor are. And this is a Republican opportunity. I think also it's a Republican opportunity to say, are we solving this problem because it's a problem, or do we have a general distaste for consumerism, a huge tendency in the Democratic Party and their great weakness, because Americans love consumerism. That the environmental prize goes to the say, we can safeguard the earth while increasing your standard of living. We don't think it's a bad thing, that people should lead a more commodious and pleasant life, and that more and more of them should do it. And one more thing that I think is going to be a huge dividing line between conservatives and liberals on this issue. One of the things we're going to need to do is to get some of the carbon out of the atmosphere. And when we think, there's a lot of talk about sequestration and carbon technologies, and none of these exist, but there is a way to do it that can be done right now, and that is you grow more trees, and you need them to grow faster. A tree is a carbon store. If you could, and there is a proposal, Freeman Dyson, the great British American physicist, has proposed, you genetically engineer trees so they grow twice as fast and twice as fat, and then you bury them. And the carbon goes back into the ground, which is where we took it out of. But that involves genetic engineering, genetic modification of plants, which is a real red flag for many people on the left wing of the Democratic Party. So a rational Republican Party can seize this issue and say that what we have here, people see this as a scientific problem, and people see it as a moral problem. People who want to solve it, people who want to use it as an opportunity to transform the American way of life. And that's an argument where Republicans and conservatives win.
Well, you know, it's wonderful to hear that. It's just that I don't see any of those Republicans making those arguments apart from a few pundits like yourself.
It's in the budget.
And the thing
coming.
the thing that's so interesting about all this is that the bogey of the left wing of the Democratic Party, which hasn't been seen in quite some time, I have to say, the Democrats are the ones talking about supporting science to come up with various innovations and investing in it. It takes investment. The Democrats are the ones that show respect for ideas and translating them into new industries and new jobs. I do understand that there are people out there who believe that consumerism is a bad thing, but I don't think they're even close to setting the tone of the Democratic Party. And I want to note that when it came to softening stands, extreme stands on social issues, the Democrats moved first. The Democrats became a party that was willing to accept some pro-life office holders and people running for office. And that is very difficult for the right wing of the Republican Party to do. I think this is one where the intensity is a trap, and it's going to be hard to pull back. And yet, most of the American population under age 45 really does not want to fight those battles anymore.
Okay, let's go to the last question, and I think this is a good question to end on. What is the single most important thing the president needs to do to be thought of as having a successful first term? If there is one thing.
Jobs.
Job creation. Is solving.
Get people back to work, make them
an
see.
improving economy?
Get credit rolling and get people back to work.
That and deliver on health care. Those two. And there's not just one. And I don't think that any president at this point is going to be able to completely solve the economic crisis in the next 4 years. And I actually think most Americans know that. So what they are looking for is visible progress on creating jobs and buffering the downturn for those who are caught in it, and I think people are going to hold the Democratic Party responsible if it can't deliver a more inclusive and cost-effective health care system.
The Republicans are counting on that.
And trying to help bring it about.
I guess I would agree that some movement towards the creation of jobs, but I say that with some trepidation given the results in California at 11.2, highest since 1941. That's just an amazing number, and of course it doesn't really reflect the number of people who have just given up looking for work, right? So it really is a big thing to try to do. But I think that the American people, if they can be convinced because they see their president actually trying to get the job done, it is really important. And so it depends on how the battle to get health care shapes up and other things along that line, because the American people are amazingly pragmatic. They really know that it doesn't change in one day. The media and the pundits in Washington are constantly, biting at everything, but there has to be a palpable sense that the country is finally moving in a different direction. And I don't know what constellation of things, but it isn't just going to be the job numbers, because I don't think the job numbers are going to be so dramatically improved, but we got to see some movement.
A little history. In his first term in office, President Bush passed the third biggest tax cut since the war, adopted the most dramatic education initiative since the middle 1960s, introduced the first permanent new social welfare program since 1974, overthrew the Taliban, overthrew Saddam Hussein, and presided over the beginning of what then looked like the greatest expansion in the financial wealth of Americans since the 1920s. 1920s. By any definition, that was an enormously successful first term. I don't think it's going to go down in history as an enormously successful presidency. And I would caution those who are urging President Obama to think about a successful first term, to remember, can we, in a university environment, invoke the classics, to remember that great line of Herodotus's, count no man happy until he is dead. A president who tries for a successful first term will have a very unhappy second term. This is a very long-term game. It is played in decades. And President Obama should be much more focused on how he can make his administration seem successful to the Americans of the year 2028 than to the Americans of the year 2012.
Oh, I think he is. He's a very strategic president and politician.
And we end then getting Theda and David to agree, actually. So my thanks to Theda Skocpol, Kathleen Parker, Maria Echaveste, David Frum. Thank you. Good night.